Hello and welcome to a Tax Foundation Talking Tax Reform discussion on the future of energy tax policy. I'm Will McBride, Vice President of Federal Tax Policy, and Stephen J. Enton, Fellow in Economics at the Tax Foundation. I'll be the moderator of the discussion, and we have two panelists that I'll introduce shortly. Before we start, two housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website for later viewing. All attendees are muted, but feel free to ask questions using the Q&A button on the bottom banner. Please include your name and organization when asking questions, and the panelist your question is directed to. Last month, Congress passed and the President signed the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, which among other things includes a number of provisions that are designed to spur the development and adoption of clean energy and the reduction of carbon emissions. This includes tax credits for a variety of things: solar, wind, and nuclear energy production, electric vehicles, residential solar panels, other energy efficient home improvements, and carbon sequestration. That is technologies that can remove carbon from the air. We estimate these tax credits have a budgetary or fiscal cost of about $330 billion over the next 10 years. And the bill includes another $120 billion in other spending on energy and climate programs, for a total expenditure of about $450 billion over 10 years. The bill increases taxes and other revenues by about $790 billion over 10 years. So more than half of the gross revenue raised in the bill is spent on energy and climate initiatives. As such, the IRA can rightly be called primarily an energy and climate bill, and perhaps, as the administration claims, the largest single piece of climate legislation ever enacted. The administration has pointed to the environmental impacts of the bill, citing outside groups that estimate it will reduce carbon emissions by about 40% over the next 10 years. Note that those estimates indicate more than half of that reduction would have occurred without the IRA. According to those studies, the IRA itself is estimated to reduce carbon emissions by about 10 to 15% over the next 10 years. Many other countries take a different approach on climate policy, usually some form of carbon pricing, such as carbon taxes or an emissions trading system. What are the pros and cons of these differing approaches? Will the Inflation Reduction Act reduce emissions sufficiently to put us on track to meet our commitment under the Paris Agreement, for instance? Or will we need to layer a carbon tax or other measure on top of this? How will industry and consumers respond to the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act? And how well can we actually predict this? To discuss these and related issues, we have two experts with us today. Our first panelist is Kristen Eberhard, Director of Climate Policy at the Niskanen Center, where she focuses on policies that encourage innovation and clean energy. She has previously worked on climate issues at the Sightline Institute and the Natural Resources Defense Council. And she has taught climate policy and energy law at Stanford Law School and UCLA School of Law. She earned her JD cum laude from the Duke University School of Law, an MEM, or Master of Environmental Management, from the Duke University Nicholas School of Environment, and a BA with honors from Stanford University. Our second panelist is Alex Murjano, Federal Policy Analyst at the Tax Foundation. Alex has researched and written on many issues relating to energy tax policy and carbon pricing, as well as ways to reform the tax code to the benefit of the broader economy. He attended Tufts University, graduating with a degree in economics and minor in finance and political science. All right, let's now get into the program. We're going to have a few questions here to guide the discussion, starting with the first question on the Inflation Reduction Act. How would each of you describe the IRA's approach to climate policy? And let's focus in particular on the tax side if you can, but let's go ahead and start with you, Alex.
Yeah, so I think there are probably two angles to consider here. First, sort of based on the broader picture of the bill, the main approach is to use tax credits to subsidize different activities that do not emit carbon, have carbon emissions, and hence incentivize people to substitute these low emission activities for fossil fuel usage. So we think about subsidies, tax subsidies for investment or production in wind or solar power, investment in development of clean hydrogen technology, or subsidies for electric vehicles. That's, it's more about the carrots than the sticks. And then I think in terms of how those subsidies are directed, I think the main focus, people often break emissions up by sector, thinking about emissions from, say, transportation, people driving, planes, or there's power generation, big industrial scale, power plants, and I think of those categories, the main focus for the emissions reduction, I think, is going to come from the power generation sector, which is to say, getting the composition of the American electricity generation moving towards more clean energy sources, moving away from coal and eventually other fossil fuels as well, and towards things like wind and solar. So I think that's sort of big picture, the sort of two ways to categorize this approach relative to others. But there are a lot more details that I think we'll get into over the course of the discussion.
Great, thanks a lot, Kristen.
Yeah, I agree. This is mostly a bundle of carrots, with one large exception, which I think Alex will talk a little bit more about later, which is a methane fee, which is a little foothold into carbon taxing. But it's mostly about credits and subsidies, and they're aimed both at the household level. So there's, credits for rooftop solar and heat pumps and other things that a household can do, as well as at the producer level, where they're aiming at, producers of solar and wind power. And I agree with Alex, it's mainly focused on the power and electricity sector, but there's a little bit in there for everyone. There are also some EV credits. There's also some funding for farm conservation programs. So there's a little sprinkling of credits for multiple sectors.
Great, a little something for everyone. All right. All right, so there's certain aspects of these provisions that are fairly novel. One is that for years, renewable energy, and as well as many fossil fuel energy provisions in the tax code have been extended on a 1 or 2 year basis, part of the annual tax extenders debate. So very much a temporary approach to tax policy, whereas this IRA, for the most part, is extending these provisions for the next 10 years. So how big a deal is that? If each of you could comment on that. We'll start again with you, Alex.
I'm muted. 2.5 years of this. I think I'd noticed that, but I guess not. Yeah, so I think it's a fundamental principle of tax policy broadly that you should want stable incentives that companies, taxpayers, individual and corporate, understand what's going to be coming and what policies they're going to face in the future. And on sort of frequent changes in environmental policy have been quite detrimental to investment in the space. And so I think moving to more stable policy making, where these credits are going to be around, companies are, of course, policies are always subject to change by Congress, but repealing something is a little bit different legislatively than just letting it expire. So having these more stable incentives are probably going to be more effective. You're probably going to get more bang for your buck if you have a tax policy that's supposed to be around for 10 years than if you have it around for 10 years, but you renew it every single year. You renew it 10 different times. I think that's going to produce better results. I think there are still some downsides to the broader approach of using credits, of course, but in the sort of constrained optimization of, okay, we're going to do credits, now how are we going to do them the best way possible, having them stable rather than needing to be renewed every year is a better way to go about it.
Okay, Kristen?
Yeah, this is a huge deal for producers of solar and wind, who in the past, when they're trying to, make the case for investment or development, they can only put those credits on their balance sheet for a couple of years. And then after that, they could say, well, we hope it might be extended, but we really can't say. So that changes the calculus for, how much risk you're willing to take. So with them now able to, put those credits out for a decade, that should spur more investment and more development in the space. And I'll also say that, on the, those are often merchant developers who are doing those projects, but utilities, they're planning on a multi-decade scale. And they are putting together these, resource plans every few years. And they will also now be looking at what is the price and availability of those renewable resources going to be to them, which will change their decisions about how they continue to invest in natural gas or coal plants that, might be an option that previously, could have looked more attractive out a decade with tax credits possibly expiring. And now that balance will probably change a little bit for some utilities.
Okay, great. Okay, so another aspect of this that again is pretty novel is the transferability of the tax credits, allowing taxpayers to buy and sell tax credits. For instance, for taxpayers who can't use the tax credits against their tax liability because, for instance, they're in a loss position, they don't have any taxable income, they can sell the tax credits to other taxpayers, and so this might one might expect this to increase the utilization of these credits ultimately and the take-up rate. But do either of you have any thoughts there on this aspect of things and how this might encourage more use of these credits or have other effects? Let's start with you, Kristen.
I don't have much to say on that particular aspect, but there's sort of a related aspect, again, going back to utilities, that smaller utilities and co-ops have previously not been able to access these credits directly. So they've had to go through a broker or, kind of a middleman, which has, just adds transaction costs to the transaction. And so they are now with the IRA able to directly access the tax credits themselves. So that will definitely sort of decrease that friction and increase efficiency and probably increase uptake, as you now have basically more utilities that can take advantage of the program directly.
All right, Alex.
Yeah, so before when if a taxpayer is starting out their facilities, that usually often businesses don't make a profit in the first year, and so they don't owe any taxes yet, so it's often hard to use the benefits of the credit that they're supposed to. And so before, you would have basically you would have some sort of partner business that did have tax liability that you would get involved with that, and then they could use the credit as well. They could use the credit because they had tax liability to offset. And so, as Kristen said, that's a significant transaction cost. Letting companies sell the benefits basically of the tax credit, instead of having to enter into a partnership, that does reduce those transaction costs, and I think will make it more efficient. But I guess it is still another layer of transaction costs, that you still have to go through the process of selling the credit, or transferring it rather.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've seen reports certainly in the Wall Street Journal and other places about entirely new markets opening up here and in exchanging these credits, different companies getting involved in this space. So it certainly seems to be spurring economic activity in certain sectors. All right, so how does this approach in the IRA compared to the status quo of how climate policy has been done previously? Alex, let's start with you.
Sure. So I think to some extent, maybe 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, or 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back. I think the big change is a move. The big improvement, I guess, is at least in some areas a move towards technology neutrality. Where before we've had, especially in the power generation sector specifically, we've had, credits for wind production or investment in wind or production in solar, production in or investment in solar, and they're not really calibrated to the social benefits of no emission technology or minimal emission technology, and they're not neutral across them either. And so going forward, they're phasing out, the bill sort of phases out these technology specific credits and moves towards a unified sort of technology neutral credits for either production or investment in no emission power production. Additionally, it creates a production credit for nuclear energy, which was historically relatively ignored by tax policy relative to other low emission sources. So that's, I guess, an improvement. But then the sort of step back side, there are a lot of other policies that are targeted at these specific ways to reduce carbon emissions or alternatives. Like there's a significant amount of money in for clean hydrogen. I've got nothing against the idea of clean hydrogen technologies, but it is sort of a targeted benefit rather than a broader incentive for green technology that maybe green hydrogen also ends up benefiting from or something. And then the credits, while they move towards technology neutrality, they have a lot of other components that aren't really about climate. There are a lot of things related to domestic sourcing of content or prevailing wages, separate additional credits for location of activity, of investment, and I think that sort of bogs down. If your main interest is just we need to reduce carbon emissions, I think adding these other policy goals on top of these incentives reduces their efficiency at getting towards the core goal. So I think that I guess big picture, just 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back.
Okay. Sounds precise. Kristen?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about how this compares to the status quo at the state level, given that this is sort of the biggest, one-time federal package related to climate, but a lot of states have been pursuing climate policy for a while, and the states that are aggressively pursuing it are all using some kind of carbon pricing. Mostly through an emission trading system. But you have 13 different states that have been using that policy mechanism for years and successfully, and a lot of them actually are using the revenue from that carbon pricing to fund things similar to what the IRA is funding at the national level. But they're getting both sides of the equation, in addition to funding clean energy and trying to spur that kind of development and innovation, they're also increasing the price of that carbon intensive competitors. So they're kind of coming at the equation for both sides. So it's just interesting that the IRA, is a first big comprehensive federal action, but it's still only coming at it from one side. And then just another aspect, thinking about the status quo is, the IRA is putting a lot of money in, but there's some problems or barriers to transitioning to a lower carbon economy that can't be solved just with money. We have a lot of permitting and regulatory barriers. And so although it was not in the IRA itself, it's definitely been attached to the discussion, kind of a serious consideration of what kind of permitting reforms do we need to do in order to actually be able to build the clean energy that the IRA is trying to push, just from the sort of money and credit side.
Okay, interesting. Okay, and so as has been mentioned, carbon pricing is another approach. How does this compare? Let's unpack that a little more. How does this the IRA approach compare to carbon pricing that's been, as Kristen, you mentioned, tried at the state level, and certainly in other countries, it's very, very common, particularly in Europe and other countries, both emissions trading systems and carbon taxes. How would you compare these approaches? Alex, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I think the advantage of carbon pricing is that it is beyond technology neutral in terms of different types of clean, no emission energy. It's neutral across basically all kinds of things that reduce carbon emissions relative to the status quo, and in ways that this bill, sort of doesn't. For example, a major driver of recent declines in emissions is shifting from coal to natural gas, because natural gas is, I believe, produces, I think, a third of the carbon emissions roughly as coal production, as coal-fired power plants do. And so if you expand, neutral incentives for, no emission technology, that doesn't really change the picture. If really the only two options in an area are going to be natural gas or coal, that doesn't really shift the incentives, but a carbon tax does. Another way that carbon emissions can be reduced is through investments in energy efficiency, that we're just going to have better appliances that consume less energy, there's some stuff for energy efficiency in this bill, but it's a little bit very specifically targeted, and having this broad incentive across the economy would be a way to not pick which of these activities makes more sense. It sort of leaves it up to the market to say, okay, but in power generation we can make these big changes in investment, and we need to replace, we can take fossil fuels, more fossil fuel plants out of circulation, or replace them with solar powered or wind power, but in, say, industrial facilities, we should just move toward, we should be investing more in energy efficiency. But the point being that you let people choose which of these activities makes the most sense, and this bill doesn't do that as much.
Yeah, I get your point. I mean, there's necessarily with this 20-something tax credits, there is a picking of winners and losers here. Hydrogen sounds like a promising technology, but will it actually be? We'll have to wait several years to find out. Whereas the broader approach of carbon pricing leaves it up to the market to determine what makes sense, 5-10 years down the road. Kristen, what are your thoughts there?
And I have a slide about kind of how I think about this. There we go. So, I think about sort of the supply side and the demand side, and then the higher carbon fuels and the lower carbon energy sources, and basically the IRA is really playing mostly down in that quadrant 4, or just trying to push more money into making lower carbon energy cheaper so that you can drive up the demand for it, which is an important piece of the puzzle. But a carbon tax is really more in quadrant 2, where you're making things more expensive based on their carbon content. And as Alex said, part of what a carbon tax can do is really target the carbon content regardless of, whether you like the technology or the technology got named, right? So, coal, if under a carbon tax, it's going to pay more if it's producing more carbon, and natural gas will pay a little bit less, and hydrogen and nuclear wouldn't pay it. So it's really just targeting that outcome that you want, and not picking the way that you're getting there. And then I'll just go back also to quadrant 3. Some of IRA is trying to ramp up production, like production tax credits are working on ramping up production of low carbon energy. But as I said, there's also sort of these other things in there with a permitting reform to get rid of the barriers that we have to do also. So I sort of think of it as like each of these quadrants play their part, and they can work synergistically together. And so if you're completely ignoring one of the quadrants, then you're missing some opportunity. So by not having a carbon tax, we're not putting that thumb on the scale that's just pushing the market in a certain way. And so so we have to pick our technologies, or target them, rather than letting them emerge in a competitive, competing for who can survive in a low carbon world.
Makes sense. All right. Well, thanks very much. So is there still room for some form of carbon pricing, either a carbon tax or a emissions trading system at the federal level? What are your, let's start with you, Kristen, on that one.
Well, obviously, from a policy perspective, very much so. Like, as I'm thinking about my quadrants, we've gotten a big injection into one of those with the IRA, but there's still a lot of room to do the carbon tax. And then just politically, a thing that Niskanen is doing a lot of work on is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which there is some openness to it politically, because the EU is working on their own carbon border adjustment mechanism, and because they do have a carbon price in place. And so once that border adjustment comes into place, American producers are going to face that at the border. And so they're starting to realize it might be in their interest to also have something in place on our side, especially because in many cases, American producers are less carbon intensive than some of their overseas competitors. And so it would be a real shame for us to miss out on capitalizing on that lower carbon intensity that we've already established, just because we don't have the policy mechanism in place. So I think there is some realization and acknowledgement interest amongst some decision makers to try and pursue a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And then also, I think that at some point in the future, there will be some political interest in looking at revenue mechanisms, and that when you look around at your revenue options, doubling down on sales taxes or income taxes might really look less smart and less attractive than introducing something like a carbon tax, which can provide revenue while also accomplishing an important policy goal of addressing climate change.
Great. Alex, what are your thoughts there? And if you could, we're talking about the revenue that could be raised from say a carbon tax. You've done some modeling there. Maybe you could give us an idea of the ballpark there of, what has been, what sort of revenues are we talking about here, say over a 10-year period?
Yeah, so I think there are probably a couple of angles to consider when evaluating a carbon price and the carbon tax in the context of after the IRA. I guess one of the questions for when people talk about the carbon tax in abstract, it's what's the social cost of carbon, which is to say, the discounted value of the future costs of carbon emissions. And so that's what we should say is the tax that people should pay. But that sort of assumes a world where there are no other sort of climate policies. and that changes so, with the IRA in place, you have all these other these subsidies for clean energy. Maybe that makes the optimal rate for the carbon tax, lower relative to the baseline, because you've got these other policies that are also doing some work for you. But that's one angle. But carbon tax, can rates that are representative in countries around the world. You could raise significant amount of money in the US. You could raise a ballpark trillion dollar for relatively middle of the road carbon tax rates. And there's sort of a political angle here, distributional arguments. The main knock against a carbon tax from people who are interested in the politics of getting something done on climate is that a carbon tax is a distributional concerns, that a carbon tax is regressive. There are a few sort of responses there. On the one hand, other climate policies also have the same distributional concerns. If you look at the distribution of benefits for credits, they typically benefit higher income earners more. I mean, higher income earners tend to own, owners of green production facilities tend to be, relatively high income, while regulations on very, on carbon emissions or highly carbon emitting activities also tend to be regressive. So the distribution is kind of is there no matter what. And similarly, on the growth, when thinking about growth, a carbon tax is a tax increase that would, reduce returns to work and be something of a disincentive there. Just like any tax, or not necessarily just like any other tax, but it has a distortive effect. But you get revenue from it that you can do other things with, like reduce general tax rates on investment or something that can be net positive for growth. Whereas with subsidies, they don't on their own they aren't on their own a tax increase, but they require tax increases to fund. And those tax increases themselves are distortionary. And we've certainly seen that with the IRA, with the book tax, which is going to be quite complicated. And so, I think those are a few angles for the context of in the context of a carbon tax after the IRA. I still think it's a viable option, but it's a question of whether it's a substitute or a complement.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Okay, so a little more on the IRA. What is there something we've missed here? Is there if there's one energy tax provision in the bill that deserves greater attention, what is it? And if each of you could address that, let's start with you, Alex.
Yeah, so Kristen hinted at this earlier, but there is a small sort of pricing mechanism in the bill for methane emissions, which are a greenhouse gas, and they're sort of small in volume relative to the amount of carbon emissions we see, but they're very sort of the greenhouse effect for them is much stronger. So the estimate people usually say, in greenhouse, they're about 11% of the impact, I guess, of greenhouse emissions in the greenhouse gas emissions from the United States. And so the price is, I think, around initially going to be $900 a ton, and then will rise to $1,500 a ton in a few years after implementation. I think it goes into effect in 2025. But I think it provides a very useful look into sort of pros and cons, or like implement or difference between a carbon price in practice, in theory versus in reality, where the sort of ideal policy can get watered down. For one, it's only a tax on methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, whereas that's only a small portion, not even depending on the source in which year you choose, not even the largest, not even the largest source of methane emissions in the US. Methane emissions, just as much, if not more, come from the agricultural sector, which is not touched by the fee. And then also there's a question of the benefit of a carbon tax, that it's a substitute for these sort of command and control regulation that can have a lot of unintended effects and otherwise not be as efficient as pricing. But there's a question of whether or not this will be, you'll be exempted from the tax if you're compliant with X, Y, and Z future EPA regulation, which, in addition to those efficiency concerns, also adds a layer of uncertainty, and part of the point of advantage of a carbon tax is that it is this sort of unified signal that is stable and that you know what it is. And so if you introduce that, regulatory layer, that kind of undermines that case. So, it's encouraging that this was like a policy choice, that this is how we're going to approach that, but it was also sort of watered down in ways that you'd want to avoid.
Okay, Kristen?
So the EV tax credits, the piece of it that relates to supply chains has gotten a lot of interest, but I think there's two other pieces of it that are also important and have gotten a little less attention. And so one is that it expands it to used vehicles, which is a pretty big change, because previously it was only for new vehicles, and a lot of Americans, those new vehicles are just out of their price range. And so being able to kind of push the EVs down into a whole different market for used vehicles is a big change. And then it also puts some income restrictions, which is trying to get at this fact that EVs are generally being adopted by wealthier people, who sort of like live in urban areas and drive fewer miles. But it's a sort of a clunky and indirect way of getting at it, and will increase these sort of transaction costs that the dealer has to be asking you about your income as you're coming onto the lot to sort of determine what car they want to tell you about. So that has gotten a little less attention, and I think that will have kind of an effect on how those credits are actually used.
Yeah, makes sense. Let's follow up on that. The EV credits. We have some follow-up questions from the audience, but I want to ask a dumb question I've thought about recently and not bothered to look up in the law. Maybe you could tell us, does it apply to golf carts, or which are battery powered? But what are the conditions there that determine the type of vehicle that there's certainly certain restrictions on the production of the batteries, right, that go in effect over several years. Has to be encourages domestic production, and there's certain income restrictions and restrictions on the price of the vehicle. But would golf carts work?
I don't know about golf carts. I know that it has passenger vehicles, light duty trucks, and then there is a category for like buses and heavier duty, like manufacturing equipment and larger trucks. But I don't know about golf carts. I know that it does not include e-bikes, which was included in previous versions, but luckily e-bikes have still benefited from just the advances in battery technology that have happened because of EV manufacturing moving along. So even though they're not getting direct subsidies, the cost of e-bikes has come down just as a ecosystem benefit of the innovation in the sector.
Okay, great. And Kristen, you wrote something earlier this year that's pretty interesting on these EV tax credits, about the distinction between subsidizing super users versus super progressives, as you describe it. So could you explain that a little more here?
Yeah, and I have a slide on this. So this is kind of going back to what I was saying about the limits on income of who's eligible for the EV tax credit. So this is legislators were worried that it's, wealthier people who are using these EV tax credits. And so they came at this with this sort of bludgeon of making people prove their income. But my idea was that there's actually a simpler way to get at what we want, or one of the things that we want with the EV tax credits is to reduce our dependence on gasoline, right? Is to have less gasoline used because vehicles are using electricity instead. And so there's a pretty simple policy mechanism that could get at that, instead of having the credit be a flat amount per vehicle, and then you're sort of putting all these limitations like, oh, it has to be this kind of vehicle and it has to be this income of the driver. Instead, what you're just trying to say is, how many gallons of gasoline is it going to replace? So if somebody is coming in wanting to buy an EV, you look at what car they're driving now, what their odometer says now, and you figure out about how many gallons of gas they generally burn in a year. And then you tailor the credit to how many gallons of gas you think you're going to replace by putting them in an EV instead of in a gas-driven vehicle. And so that would, in these crucial years where we're really trying to push down our emissions, and the sooner we can do it, the better. 1 ton of emissions replaced in 2032 is not worth as much as 1 ton of emissions replaced in 2022 in terms of a changing climate. So, we have a limited amount of money for EV subsidies. We want to displace as much gasoline as possible as soon as possible. We should be getting those EVs into the hands of the people who drive the most. This also has the added benefit that those are the people for whom it's going to make the most difference. If they're burning a ton of gasoline, that means they're spending a lot of money on gas, and having an EV is going to make a big difference for their lives. And often these are, the people who are burning the most gas, often that's like a small business owner who's driving a truck around with their, gardening equipment. And so giving them an EV truck instead makes a huge difference for their life and for their business. So anyway, this graph is just showing, if we sort of continue on this route of, giving out these credits to the people who want EVs, but who really aren't burning that much gas to begin with, versus if we really tried to target and get them into the hands of the super users who are really dependent on gasoline right now and could, really displace a lot by getting EV, just how much of a difference that makes in terms of gasoline burn and in terms of, and then if you go to the next slide, it shows you in terms of the emissions that we could replace. So if we're trying to get to this goal of reducing our emissions by about half by 2030, how much money we would have to spend if we spend that only on the super progressives versus how much money we would have to spend on EV credits to get there by spending it on the super users. So basically, if what you're caring about is helping people who are dependent on gas and reducing our climate emissions, you would target this subsidy more carefully at gallons of gas displaced instead of at what your income is.
Okay, yeah, interesting perspective there. And it made me think of the old gas tax, which of course hasn't been touched since I think 1993, and has as a result lost much of its bite due to because it is not inflation adjusted. So whereas the states have been raising the gas tax, many states several times since 1993, the federal government is not touching it, and no indication they will touch it. But that would be another approach to addressing these super users, as you say, of gasoline. And would raise a lot of revenue, by the way. We have modeled that. You can see those estimates on our website. All right, so with the time remaining, why don't we get to some of the audience questions? There's a question about batteries, and there's been many reports on this sort of the bottlenecks there of getting the materials together to produce these batteries, the big one being lithium. You may have seen the reports of the prices of lithium going through the roof. I think they're up about tenfold in the last 2 years. So there's a question here about this aspect. Is there anything in the new legislation for establishing mandatory recycling of lithium-ion batteries used in EV vehicles? Are there any subsidies there, for instance, to do this? Any thoughts there on that one? Start with you, Kristen.
I do not believe there's any requirements around recycling, but there are requirements around the supply chain of vehicles that are eligible for the EV subsidy. So there's sort of two pieces of it. Your manufacturing and your supply chain have to be in the US or with US trading partners in order for your vehicle to be eligible. So that is putting a lot of pressure on automakers to really diversify their supply chains away from China, basically. And so that should also create some pressure if recycling is one way of getting that supply domestically. So if right now they're not getting that supply domestically because it's cheaper to just buy it from China, well, now their subsidy is on the line, and so that kind of creates a little premium for maybe recycling now becomes more of a viable option because the subsidy is tied to it. So it should just generally be really pushing the domestic industry and the ability to mine lithium. We have lithium in this country and we could mine it. But also if there's a source from recycled content, I'm sure that manufacturers are going to be very interested in looking into that.
Alex?
Yeah, I think just on the lithium issue, I don't think there's anything strongly related to it in the bill. And there are a lot of issues where I could easily sort of roll my eyes and say, well, a carbon tax could do that better. But I don't think lithium I think becomes a different issue. I think that's more a regulatory thing, where lithium mines can be like environmentally damaging locally, and so there's like there's an interesting tension that often comes up between sort of big picture. We need this for technologies to dramatically reduce carbon emissions before relative to this sort of localized, well, it's going to cause some problems around here. So I think if you want to do that, it's a regulatory thing to make it's not. I think that's most of the reason why. I mean, initially I remember having a conversation with someone and I said, well, isn't it a question of where the stuff, do we just not have lithium here? It's like, no, it's just that we do. It's just regulatory issues prevent us from using it. So I think that becomes mostly a regulatory question. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense. Let's see, we have a related question, if somewhat particular here about batteries. Sorry, trying to find it here. A question about battery, any provision in the bill related to battery energy systems. I don't know if that's, I think there is a credit targeting batteries, but I'm not, if anyone can provide any wisdom here on how that might affect.
Yeah, there are, I think maybe this person's talking about more like not EV batteries, but battery storage for electric utility. Yeah, there are some credits and incentives for utility scale storage, battery storage systems.
Okay, and yeah, that will of course complement bringing renewable sources of energy onto the grid, as those are one of the major drawbacks with solar and wind, for instance, is their intermittent nature. Okay, so let's take one relating to the sale of tax credits, as we were discussing earlier. It's a question of if there's any sort of central clearinghouse for the sale of these tax credits, any provision in the bill to set that up or encourage development of something like that.
I'm not sure there is a explicitly defined. I'm not sure if that's been is explicitly sort of created in the bill. I think though that, you know, based on what you said earlier, Will, that these markets are coming into existence now, and you know, so I think that'll how that's going to work, it will become clearer over time as these credits come into effect and these changes come into effect. So I guess we'll see, but I'm not aware of anything explicitly defined like that in the bill.
Okay. Kristen, any no? So related, is there regarding the Salem tax credits, is there any expectation of regulations and any idea about what form those regulations might take at this point regarding any abuse of that process? Anyone have any insights on regulation, which is of course not out there yet, and it's going to take probably several weeks or months before we get regulation on many of these things coming from Treasury. But any thoughts on that one? Okay.
Just wait and see. Wait and see.
Yeah, wait and see. Hope for the best. So somewhat related to that, I mean, I think we're getting to this point. There's a question about the compliance cost here. An audience member has a question about the complicated nature of these provisions. It sounds like this person is a tax practitioner, and they're saying the compliance cost for many of these provisions are quite excessive, the reporting requirements, et cetera. And what are our thoughts there on that, and how that might reduce the overall benefits of this package? Alex, thoughts?
Yeah, so I think there are a few dimensions here. On the one hand, you could say, well, not only are, for example, in the case of the electricity production side credits, not only are they somewhat consolidated, they're also expanded. And on the one hand, you could say, well, if the compliance costs are basically fixed, but we're going to make the benefits larger, then you'd expect that to have that would be an improvement. That would be the ratio of, you know, the benefits you get versus the time you have to comply with it. Like, you know, if I made you fill out, you know, if I made you fill out forms for 10 hours to get a $10 tax credit, like no one would do that. But if the tax credit was $1,000, maybe people would. So, you know, that maybe changes the viability just by nature of the benefit being larger. On the other hand, it does also come with all these new, you know, additional incentives about, you know, prevailing wage requirements or domestic content and apprenticeship programs and stuff that I think would add to the compliance burden. So I mean, certainly in the past that they've been, you know, I think somewhat effective at driving additional investment. It's always tough to tell with credits how much of it is inframarginal, where someone's, you know, scooping the benefits for investment they were going to undertake anyway. But, you know, there have been some new investment being driven by the credits in the past, so it's not like it's, you know, insurmountable compliance costs, but that certainly is like a downside of doing sort of environmental policy through all these different credits. I mean, you know, just trying to keep track of them all. Yeah.
Right. Okay, Kristen?
I don't really have anything to add on that, just that, you know, what Alex said, it's if there's too much paperwork, it makes it harder. So, and I know that on the, at least the like individual side, that there was at least discussion of trying to make it a little easier, more streamlined. A lot of the the residential credits are sort of combined, where you just fill out the thing once and you can get, the heat pump and the electrical panel replacement and whatever to try and make it a little bit more streamlined. But I don't know what the changes were on the business side.
Okay, yeah, business side, I imagine there's a lot of planning opportunities there and compliance opportunities for accounting firms and others out there. So maybe some jobs created on that side of things, but maybe not the best way to address climate issues. So any parting thoughts here? We've got a couple minutes. Each of you, give you just a little bit of time to give any other thoughts on the IRA or carbon pricing in general. Alex, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess my big picture takeaway is that it's, a little bit, it's more of the same, maybe a little bit better of the same, but certainly not as sort of seismic improvement in how we approach a climate policy. And there are a lot of, carbon pricing would both address the same issues and address things that aren't, covered by this approach that help reduce emissions as well. So, and I guess the other issue is that none of this takes place in a vacuum. There are other taxes that either have to be raised to pay for credits, and there are taxes that can be lowered when you implement a carbon pricing. So it always makes sense to look at things in a broader picture as well.
Okay, great, Kristen.
Yeah, I think the IRA, it's going to do a lot to push sort of interest and investment in low carbon options, especially in the electricity sector. And I think the next big policy discussion is how to remove the red tape so that those businesses can actually put steel in the ground and build. And then I hope that once we've sort of started to build some stuff, that the policy discussion will come back around to carbon pricing as an efficient way to push everything in the economy towards lower carbon innovation and options.
All right, that sounds great. Well, that's the top of the hour, and that's the end of our program. I want to thank our panelists, Kristen Everhart and Alex Marjano. This has been fascinating. We've just, I'm afraid, scratched the surface here. You're going to have to spend several more hours to figure out all of these provisions and programs in the IRA. So please follow what we're doing on this on our website and the Tax Foundation and the Niskanen Center also have good research on climate issues. And just reiterating that this program, this webinar is recorded, and you'll be able to find it on our website in the near future. And until next time, take care, everyone, and we'll see you later. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.